I appreciated how Jeremiah kind of prayed that at the end, because what we really are trying to do, even though we're looking at this point in time at a letter called First Corinthians or 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, where a figure called the Apostle Paul, or the Sent One, Paul, is trying to explain elements of humility to a church in Corinth in ancient Greece. What he's really trying to do is to help that church understand how Jesus wants to transform their lives and the way that they view what life is really about. And their culture is a unique one, and it really prizes honor above many other things. And so it's a constant effort to climb the ladder and try to get as much status and as much recognition in their society and their culture as possible. And in some ways, we can kind of identify. And maybe you're not all about doing things to bring yourself honor, but our culture in general is very much about doing things to maybe experience entertainment and pleasure and a comfortable life and, acquire enough wealth to where we feel like we have stability and have a nice home. And maybe for some of us, even so we can compare ourselves with other people around us and say, I'm doing pretty good. At least I'm not like them, or at least I'm not struggling like they are, things of that nature. And so maybe some elements of this kind of society in ancient Corinth are things that resonate with us as well. But we have been on this journey again to look at honor versus humility, and how Paul is going to challenge the ways people think in ancient Corinth, the way their culture has just designed them to think, has influenced them, and how different that is from what we see of Jesus Christ humbly going to a cross to pay for the sins of humanity and bridge the gap between people and God once again. And when you set those images of wanting to be a king and wanting to be the best, and Jesus hang on a cross side by side, there's a stark difference. And Paul wants to say, if you're trying to follow Jesus, maybe your life should look more like Jesus's than like the kings that you think you are. And in this passage, he kind of hits that directly on the head. Last week, we looked at humility, because again, Paul's setting these foundational issues up in the first part of the book, and then he's going to go into specific areas of their life and address questions that they've answered and talk about, how different segments of their life maybe don't reflect humility and don't look like Christ yet would want them to look. But before he gets into the specifics, he lays the groundwork. And so last week we looked at some inward signs of humility. And there's really kind of two sides of the coin. There's the not thinking more highly about yourself side of the coin, not bragging, even if it's internally, just comparing yourselves and thinking, I'm glad I'm not them. I'm so great. And then there's the opposite side, which is being judgmental. And that's thinking less highly of others because of specific things that we see them do or say. And Paul reminds the Corinthians, and I think this is a great reminder for us, most of the time there's details that we're missing when we come to quick conclusions or judgmental conclusions about other people. There's hidden details that we don't know. There's true motives that we don't know. And it's just so easy for us to misunderstand and misinterpret what we see. And so the more humble approach is to not think less highly of other people because of these specific things we notice in their life or things that they do, and to not think too highly of us. And now Paul's going to transition today from looking at what humility looks like on the inside to what humility looks like on the outside. And this is where there's some clear differences between the Corinthians' idea of what lifestyle and living should look like and what Paul's idea and Jesus' idea of what different elements of their everyday life should look like. And so that's what we're going to look in today. I titled it Go Low because I think that's kind of the end message that Paul would have for the Corinthians and probably for us as well. We're looking at 1 Corinthians 4 verses 8 to 17 this morning as we go through things. So first we're going to look at taking on humble roles. That's the first outward sign of humility, is a willingness to take on humble roles with the things that we do in our lives. And this is how Paul starts. He says in verse 8, you are already filled. And that word filled, it's like you went to a buffet and you're just crammed full of food. That's the best way I know to illustrate it. That's what's behind that word in the ancient Greek language. It's not like, I'm doing okay. It's, I'm so stuffed. You have already become rich. You have become kings without us. And indeed, I wish that you had become kings so that we also might reign with you. Paul, he uses hyperbole and exaggeration a little bit here. He uses irony a lot. And so you're supposed to look at this and go, I think Paul's exaggerating a little bit. But he's really playing this up and really playing the way that the Corinthians approach their lives up a little bit here, and he's saying, some of you, when I look at your life, it almost seems like you're kings. Like you could be mistaken for a king out there in the ancient Greco-Roman Empire. And you're doing that without us. And I wish you were kings so you could lift us up into your position, and we could experience what you're experiencing. And he says, you guys, like when I look at you, you're stuffed. Like you're so full. You've been gorging yourself on all the things that you have. You're wealthy, you're successful, and you're in control of things, or at least that's the image that you want to portray among each other as a church. And there's so much competition and so much comparison and so much of a desire to become these things that their culture elevates, right? And maybe those are things that we see and we feel to some degree of pressure to achieve in our own society because of the way people perceive us. But then in a moment, he's going to talk about how people look at him and the other apostles. So the word apostle, it appears in the New Testament a lot. It simply means sent ones. And Jesus first used it to apply to the 12 individuals that were closest to him during his time in ministry on earth. And he was sending those people out. It also is a term that applies to the Apostle Paul as he's sent out beyond Israel to some of the other nations and different regions of the Roman Empire. It also applies to some other individuals in the New Testament who are sent out by God. Maybe similar to how you might envision missionaries today being sent into a new place, a different environment to share some message about God or some truth. And Paul says, essentially, myself and the other apostles, when you look at us, we don't seem like kings. In fact, you could mistake us for the lowest segments of society, for the absolute lowest class people. There's a huge difference between how we look, the roles we take on, and the roles that you're taking on as kings and queens in Corinth, so to speak. And then he goes into detail here. He says in verse 9 here, whoops, did I go ahead? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Verse 9, for I think God has exhibited us, the apostles, last of all. You're kings, and we're like the last place, right? As men condemned to death. And those words exhibited us, it's like we're being pointed out or pointed at as people who are condemned to death. And these are illustrations in their culture that are going to make more sense because in the ancient Roman Empire, it was common for military generals occasionally to be given triumph parades. And at these parades where the Roman military achieved major military victories, they would take some of the captives and they would parade them behind the Roman generals and the Roman military. And everybody would just point at them and stare at them. And some of those people in that parade were people that were going to be condemned to death shortly after the parade ended. And then there was another kind of procession in the ancient Roman world, and that was where criminals were paraded to their deaths, to their crucifixions. And you can read about that happening to Jesus and a couple other criminals, right, in the Gospels, where they're paraded through the city of Jerusalem, then eventually they land outside the city where they're hung on crosses to await their death. And so that was another common type of parade that happened. And of course, people would point and stare and throw things at and spit at these criminals, much like they did to Jesus and the two criminals that were crucified with him that day that the Bible describes as well. And so this is kind of a common imagery. But those criminals and those captives were the absolute bottom of the barrel as far as society was concerned. Nobody wanted to be in their places. And yet Paul says, I feel like that the apostles, that's how people respond to us. Our lives look so odd because we're trying to live out these different principles that Jesus taught us to live by. And we just think so differently than most of the culture around us that we just seem odd. And people just point at us like we're those odd criminals or captives in a parade. Another thing that he says in the next few verses as well, he says, because we have become a spectacle. And now he's switching over to a different image from the ancient Roman world, and that's that of a theater. We still have theaters today where we go and watch people do plays, so this is not an uncommon idea for us to wrap our minds around either. But he says, we've become a spectacle. Literally, in Greek, it's the word theater. We're a theater. To some translations say to the world, but it's cosmos, it's the universe, it's everything. It's like the whole universe is looking at us, and we are actors on a stage. He says both to angels and to humans. And so it's almost like we as God sent ones, like the angels are watching us in the seating, and all of humanity is watching us in the seating. And he says in verse 10, We are fools on account of Christ, but you're prudent. You're very thoughtful and discerning, Christ. We seem like the weak characters, but you're so strong. You're distinguished, but we are the ones that are without any honor. We're the shameful ones. And I think what Paul's doing here is he's using a theater image that the ancient Corinthians will really wrap their minds around, because it's in ancient Greece, and Greek theater has a huge history at that point in time. And he's talking, I think, about comedy plays and how Greek comedy plays play out. And so in a Greek comedy, you have two types of roles. You have those who are the fools, and you have those who are the wise. But the thing that's so funny about Greek comedies is that they're juxtaposed, they're switched. So the people who have positions of leadership and power are the ones who are portrayed as fools in Greek comedies, right? So we would say maybe the politicians are the ones who are portrayed as fools in Greek comedy. And of course, everybody likes to laugh at the politicians in ancient Greece, and many people do today as well. And then those who were kind of foolish characters would be the ones that would be portrayed as super wise and intelligent and thoughtful. And Paul's saying it's like that. It's like we have this Greek comedy that's playing out, only it's playing out on a universal scale, and all the spectators are angels and humans, and we happen as apostles to land the roles of the fool, the village idiots. But the irony is the people who play the parts of the fools, like they're actually the leaders. And then you guys, your roles bring you so much honor. But the irony of that is that in Greek comedies, the people who gain so much honor, they're actually the people that are living a little bit foolishly. I want to read a couple of lines from some ancient Greek plays, comedy plays, to give you a little bit more of a window into this. These are both by the playwright Aristophanes, so he was a famous ancient Greek comedy writer. So here's a line that might be spoken about, again, somebody in leadership. You possess all the attributes of a politician, a screeching, horrible voice, a perverse, cross-grained nature, and language of the marketplace. In you all is united, which is needful for governing. Do you hear the irony there? Right? Not very flattering, right? You've got a horrible-sounding voice. You've got a bad character, and you talk like somebody at the workplace. You've got everything you need to be a politician. That's how people in leadership would be presented. And of course, everybody in the audience would laugh. Ha 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 ha. And then you would see these people who were actually making poor choices presented as so wise. For example, this other character in Aristophanes' play, The Knights. Quickly, bring me a beaker of wine so that I may wet my mind and say something witty. Right? Give me more alcohol so I can say smart stuff. And of course, this is the character that's elevated as wise. And Paul's saying, I think, this is highly ironic. As God sent ones, we landed the roles that everybody likes to laugh at. We're the fools just entertaining humans and angels in some kind of cosmic theater. That's who we are. We're like the lowest rungs of society here. But that's because of the roles that they've taken on. Again, why are they being mistaken for the lowest classes of society? Why are they being pointed at like criminals or captives on parade? Why are they being watched like comedians? It's because the things that they do with their lives, they take on very uncomfortable roles, very unattractive roles in the eyes of society, very even humiliating roles that people would feel too good to take on. Like if I take on that role, people are going to assume I'm less than what I really am, and they're not going to respect me as much, so I'm going to avoid doing those types of service at all costs. That's what the apostles were focusing on. They were actually serving people sacrificially and humbly like Jesus. And other people were saying, that's a little too much for us. We don't want to damage our reputation by serving the least of these the way that Christ did. And that's what caused them to be perceived in that way, is because they were willing to take on humble roles. And as we see in the end in a few moments, Paul's going to say, I think you should take a page out of my playbook and Jesus' playbook and be willing to take on humble roles instead of being so concerned about doing the things that are going to bring you honor and coming across as being so wise and so strong and so generous. Why don't you take on some of the roles that are going to be less appreciated than that? The second sign of outward humility that Paul's going to mention and say, I think this is what true humility looks like from the outside, is living on humble resources. Living on humble resources. That would be another trait that's associated with the least people in society, by the way, at this point in time, because, again, people are looking at each other, kind of gauging each other based on their status and their wealth and all those things. And, of course, the people at the bottom of society would have the least resources. And ironically, that's the case when it comes to these apostles as well. He says in verse 11, up to this present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty. And that's not just like occasionally. These are strong words in the ancient Greek language. This was written in the New Testament. And it means that you're experiencing hunger and thirst to the point of pain. If you've ever maybe fasted, or if you've been in maybe impoverished situations in the past and you've literally experienced hunger pains, or you feel thirsty, you're so parched. That's the kind of situation that Paul's describing. And he's saying, ironically, these ones that Jesus sent out, like we're experiencing that kind of, like our resources are stretched so thin that that's our experience. And we're poorly clothed. So maybe the clothes are starting to wear out and the sandals, starting to wear thin or holes worn through them. And we're roughly treated. And this is kind of a blanket term for different kinds of physical abuse that they've been experiencing. And we're homeless. We don't know where we're going to spend the next night. We're here traveling around from city to city, relying on people's hospitality. We don't have a home to go back to. Our family went on vacation about a month and a half ago up to the Oregon coast and Washington State and kind of Idaho on a little loop trip. And, we had a place to come home to. And it's always wonderful to experience new places. I was talking with a couple of you this morning. You were telling me about a trip that you took to Arizona recently. And it's so neat to get out of the box and to see new places. But there's something refreshing about having a place to call home, right? And maybe you've been through times in life where you haven't had a place to call home, or you didn't know where that place is going to be next, or you're just relying on hospitality or friends, sleeping on couches, different places. And that's kind of what the apostles have been dealing with because they've been sent out by God away from the stability of their families, away from the stability of their home communities, away from the stability of their homes that they grew up in, their houses, or that they inherited or had, away from the stability of like normal jobs because they're always on the move to take the message of Jesus to these unfamiliar places. And so their resources, because of the line of work that they're doing, because of how God has called them, they're just forced to deal with more humble resources and to live on that. And I want to, just for a moment, to take a short little rabbit trail here for just about 2 or 3 minutes. So put yourself in the shoes of people who are trying to live, on very humble means. And as you look around the room, you might see different people who are part of God's kingdom, who are following Jesus, and the amount of resources they have are going to vary so widely. Some of you, you were born into situations where you just had more privilege. Maybe you came from a wealthy family and you inherited money and you didn't do anything, but that was just a blessing that came into your life. And then others of you came into life in extreme poverty. Some of you have been in positions where you were able to be in locations, or you're at the right place at the right time that connected you with a job that paid you well. Others of you, because of maybe even how God has led you, you've been on the move more, or you've been taking these very basic service level jobs. Or maybe that's just how God's inclined you or wired you. Your heart is to become a teacher or become a first responder. I mean, these careers are not super lucrative, right? And then others of you, again, you've done really well for yourself. And so in the church, in this group of people who are following Jesus, you have an incredible amount of variety of resources for an incredible amount of different reasons. Again, some beyond our control, some because of things that we've done or said or chosen, some just because God has worked it out, and then some because of the callings that we're trying to follow to, again, do what we feel like God is leading us to do in life. So there's all kinds of different situations that we're navigating. And because of that, Jesus urges people who have entered God's kingdom to take care of each other. And that's kind of what Paul's going to drive at here in a moment. And so we don't look at it as, well, I'm glad I have what I need. I feel so bad for those other people, but if they would have done what I did, they could have that too. That's more of an American way of looking at things. We see each other as a family and as a community. And that's the way that Jesus urges people in his teachings as well. And so one question that follows is, we talk about God's kingdom. What do we mean by that? That's a term that you'll hear me use here a lot if you're newer to this church family or if you're just visiting today. What do we mean by that? Jesus uses a kingdom as a metaphor in his teachings to people. A king has somebody who's ruling, and a king has people who are following that ruler, but it's a community of people, right? It's a city or an empire or something, community of people. And so when Jesus talks about God's kingdom, this is kind of in a nutshell what he's talking about. He's talking about a community of people who have decided to allow God to rule over their lives once again. Because in the very beginning, the first few pages of the Bible, there's a story that's presented where God creates humanity along with a lot of other things in this world and beyond. And he wants to partner with humanity. He makes humans in his image to reveal things about him, to image him and kind of imitate him in different ways. And he wants to work together with humanity. But he gives them a choice, and it's essentially, you can work with me or you can do things under your own wisdom. You can make your own choices and decisions, and it's represented by this tree with a piece of fruit on it, and they're said, you can eat from these other trees in the garden, but don't eat the tree off of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. When you do it, you're going to die. And so, of course, humans being the curious lot that they are, it wasn't too long before people thought and were even persuaded to say, well, maybe I could do this whole thing better than God could. And so people made their own choice to do things on their own, independent of God, and fell away from God. And that kind of rebellion, in a sense, had a lot of different consequences that play out in a lot of different ways in our lives and our world today. But there is a community of people who look back and they say, I think things would have worked out better if we let God lead us on this whole life thing. And so maybe we need him to show us what good and bad truly are and what wise and unwise truly are. Maybe that first choice in that garden a long time ago wasn't such a great choice. And so this group of people say, we want God to rule over us again. And then there's also kind of a second mark of that group of people, and that's how they enter into that kingdom. And it revolves around Jesus. And this is kind of what people in God's kingdom, in a nutshell, believe about Jesus. Jesus is a divine king. He's God who became humanity. And all these different statements are based on things throughout the whole first part of the Bible, the Hebrew part of the Bible we call the Old Testament. Because for many, many years, after people chose to rebel against God and go their own way, God has had this plan and this process of trying to bring people back to him, to a relationship with him, and to a place of realizing we need God to be the one that rules over our lives again. And so the way that God promised to kind of reconcile and repair that relationship was by one day sending a king. This king would be human, but this king would be fully God, God in the flesh. And this king would come and rescue humans from the consequence and the condition of their rebellion. And so the death that was pronounced for eating off of the tree in the Garden of Eden that fell upon all of humanity, this king would take upon himself and die in the place of humanity to take their consequence, in a sense, to take on their rebellious condition. This king would also show us the way that life was intended to be lived, would model, because this king is God and human, would model the type of life that God wanted people to live in the beginning. This king would also restore right relationships between people and God, but also between people and each other, would enable people to live in right ways with one another. And this king would one day resurrect or raise back to life or restore the entire natural world. Humans, creatures, the world, the way it operates. And so all of that was kind of bundled together through a lot of disconnected different prophecies and predictions and statements by God all throughout maybe 1,500 years of time in the Old Testament. And so people that were listening to Jesus teach, they were Jewish and they realized those things. They kind of had that background in their head of this is who Jesus is. This is who he's claiming to be. He's the one that's going to bring people and God back together again. They didn't all see that he would do it through his death. But that's kind of what God's kingdom is about. And Paul has been teaching the Corinthians about entering God's kingdom through faith in Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross, how that is the thing that allows people to come back into a state of forgiveness and innocence before God. That is the thing that takes the penalty out of the way. And so that, in essence, is what Jesus has been teaching about. But when he describes the way that people in his kingdom treat each other, and now we're off the rabbit trail and back on, he says, when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So there's this assumption that people in God's kingdom, in this family, this community, they're going to take care of the poor, people with less resources. So your charitable giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So there's an assumption that there's going to be charitable giving. Then later on in that same chapter, Matthew 7, he says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust don't destroy, where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So there's this idea that you're going to essentially focus on the needs of others instead of just accumulating stuff here in this life. And that's what he's challenging his followers toward. But among the Corinthians, and perhaps among some of the other churches, the apostles, the ones that Jesus sent out to carry his message out to Israel and beyond, they're being overlooked, and they currently lack the basic essentials in life. Because again, he said, up to this present hour, we're hungry and thirsty, we lack food and drink, we're poorly clothed, all these things, we're homeless. He also says we're roughly treated, we're physically abused. And I just want to point this out because I think it's a valid point here. Their lack of resources makes them even more vulnerable to mistreatment. And if you, different people have done social studies on vulnerable people in our societies today, and it seems as though there's a correlation. The less resources people have, the more poverty people experience, the easier it is for those people to be abused and mistreated, right? And oftentimes this kind of makes logical sense because if you think about it, maybe somebody who is the source of that abuse, is in a position of power. They're providing something for that person, that they don't have. And if you walk away from that, where are you going to go? It's easier to take advantage of poor people, unfortunately. And that's something that the apostles have run into in their own experience as well. Verse 12, he says, we labor working for ourselves with our own hands. So it's not like the apostles aren't putting out any effort. They're actually exhausted. That word labor has the idea of absolutely physically exhausted or depleted. Okay? Working for ourselves with our own hands. So they're doing manual labor to provide for themselves. And probably what this looks like is either using a trade that they acquired when they were younger, just whatever opportunities, wherever God sends them to work that trade, like the Apostle Paul sold tents or made tents in the marketplace and sold them because he was trained in that trade growing up. What also happened a lot in the ancient world is people who were in a new place, didn't have work, they just show up at the marketplace in the morning, and people looking to hire out somebody for the day would show up and say, hey, I'll pay you this wage if you work for me for the day. And it was normally working in fields or harvesting stuff, pretty hard work, digging holes, working on building projects, stuff like that. We would call that a temp agency today. We still have that. And you show up and you do the grunt work, but you make money for it. And that's what these apostles are experiencing. The only catch is that most of these guys are in their 50s at this point in time. I'm not sure where you stack up, and I'm not sure how physically fit and strong you feel like you are in your 50s, will be in your 50s, or were in your 50s. But this is hard work for a guy in their 50s. And yet they're rolling up their sleeves and they're willing to do this just to, it seems, scrape by. And there's another thing about people that have a heart to serve people. And the passage doesn't tell us this, but I'm going to make this assumption because it's true of almost everyone I've seen in this type of position. I'm gonna bet that they probably give pretty generously from what little they have to meet the needs of other people in the churches. There have actually been studies done as far as people giving in nonprofit organizations, even in our culture today. And some of the best givers are some of the people with the least money. It's an ironic thing. Maybe because when you have little, you really empathize with the needs of other people. And so you're willing to sacrifice what little you have for others because you know what it feels like. And if you have more, you're a little more distanced physically and emotionally from connecting with those feelings. So it's a little harder to have empathy maybe because you can't really relate as personally. But I think They're working hard with their hands and they're still barely scraping by because they're seeing other people's needs around them and they can't help but also meet those needs. Meanwhile, some of the Corinthians are feasting. They're stuffed and they're flaunting their wealth. You could mistake them for kings. And I think what also is affecting Paul so strongly is that as you read further into 1 Corinthians, you realize that there are also people in the Corinthian church that are right where the apostles are. People with barely enough, who are barely scraping to get by. And so within the same room as we're here today, you have people that are flaunting their success and wealth and, oh, I'm so stuffed today. And then you have people who are experiencing hunger pains and have a parched mouth and have no place that night to call home. And yet there seems to be very little concern on the part of one for the needs of the other. And Paul's saying that's not humility. Living on humble resources is a sign of humility. Even if you have a lot, if you're willing to give, it automatically puts you in a more humble place than you were. If you have a little bit, then it's not hard to fall into that humble state. So that's another aspect of humility outwardly. And then the final thing we'll talk about this morning is relying on humble responses. And I want to tell you up front, I think this is one of the most difficult things that I've encountered about the way that Jesus lives for me to actually apply in my own life. Because it's painful, honestly, to respond to people in this way. This is definitely going low. But it's something that the apostles are good at, and I think it's something that we need to be challenged by in the way that we relate with people as well, if we want to be humble. And again, this is something that the Corinthians were definitely, I think that culture was pushing them completely in the opposite direction, where this would have been super hard for them to respond in these ways. But Paul continues on. He says, when we are verbally abused, we bless. So when people insult us, they're yelling at us, they are harsh toward us, they're degrading us, we respond by blessing. And that word literally, it means speaking good words back. And it might be good in different ways, but I think what the Corinthian culture would have pushed them or encouraged them toward would be to match force with force. When somebody verbally abuses you, you use the same amount of force back on that person, and you hurl insults back at them, and you hurl abuse back at them. If they yell at you, you yell back. If they rebuke you, you rebuke them back. If they harass you, you harass them back. If they label you, you label them back. If they scold you, you scold them back. And you do it to protect your reputation. Because if you don't, you're letting them appear like they're stronger than you are, and maybe they're right. But if you hit them hard, just as forcefully as they hit you, then you're going to preserve your reputation. Because you're going to appear to be the strong one, or at least just as strong as they are. But the apostles, their approach is very different. They respond graciously when people say harsh or hateful things to them. I've had a lot of personal experience with this. I think the most vivid probably was more recently, I've talked about working a second job at a hotel for a while. And I would have people call on the phone or walk up in person and just start swearing at me because of an experience they had that they were dissatisfied with. And I can tell you that the most natural thing in those moments is to respond back in exactly the same way. That's also the fastest way to get fired and lose your job if you work in the hospitality industry. And so I had a lot of practice with holding my tongue and trying to be gracious and understanding people in those moments. But let me tell you, it is not natural. And in Corinth, it's not even the culturally appropriate thing to do. But yet the apostles, they're relying on humility to do something that force can't possibly do. We'll talk about what that might be in just a moment. Here's the next thing they say. When we're persecuted, and this is a word that's used throughout the New Testament. It literally means forced to flee. So like you're pushed out of some place or forced to move on, forced to leave your circumstances. It can also mean mistreated or harassed. There's a lot of different kind of nuances of it. But he says we endure it. And literally it says we hold ourselves up. So it's not like we just suck it up and deal with it. It's like the apostles together, they realize we're all experiencing this to some degree. We're being mistreated or harassed or pushed out from these locations to go somewhere else with the message of Scripture, and we can kind of all relate on a level. And so we have to be the ones that encourage each other in these times. So they're responding supportively. They're holding each other up when people do harsh or hurtful things to them. And they're looking around going, oh, that person really got mistreated, or they got pushed out of that city. So I need to make an effort to be an encouragement to them, to help prop them up and support them, because I see what they're going through and I see how people are treating them. In the Corinthian culture, however, the normal response would have been quite different. The Corinthians would have been encouraged by their culture to shun friends who had been publicly shamed, so that they wouldn't incur shame by association. So if I'm living in ancient Corinth and you're my friend, and somebody comes up to me and they publicly embarrass me, or they drive me out of the city, or they harass me, or they mistreat me, maybe they physically beat me or hit me, okay? If you stay my friend and if you come and wrap your arm around me and you support me, what that's doing is, because it was real, I was treated in a way that brought shame to me. It actually brought my value down in society, because now I'm this shameful thing. And if you stay my friend, some of my shamefulness, because of the way I was treated, is going to rub off on you. And so your status is going to drop. And so unless you want to be associated with me, the best thing you can do is just forget that I exist and ignore me, right? Drop me in that moment. But Paul's saying that's not the way of Jesus. We have to hold each other up when people do harsh or hurtful things to us. The last thing on the humble response, and again, all these I think are terribly difficult and painful. When we are slandered, so when somebody slanders you, they say something that's wrong about you, like it's just a flat out lie, or it's evil, it's bad. You know, they talk about one of your negative character traits, or they make up a negative character trait that's not even true, but they're trying to basically damage your reputation by misrepresenting you, saying, well, that person's wrong because they did this and I'm right. That person's evil. That person's bad because they did that. And gossip is the vehicle for this most of the time. People use gossip to speak wrong or evil things about other people. He says when people do that to us, when they talk about us, we reply as friends. We reply as friends. And it uses the same word. This word means to call somebody alongside you in the New Testament, to challenge them or to comfort them. And so when the apostles find out that people are gossiping about them and treating bad about them, and somebody comes up, and says, hey, like, this is what I heard, or these people are saying this thing about you, what Paul and the apostles are doing is they are personally responding. And they're going either to those people or to the people that have been misinformed and saying, let's just sit down and have a chat. I want to challenge you with what the real perspective might be. Let me give you another angle on this. Or, you know what? I even want to just reach out and be a comfort to you, because I know this is something you're struggling with about me, and, I just want to sit and listen and talk. That's how they're responding when people are talking bad, saying these harsh or hurtful things, many of them inaccurate or untrue about them. But in ancient Corinth, they would have been encouraged to just discredit people that were portraying them as wrong or evil. If somebody's gossiping about you, you know what you do? You gossip about them, and then you discredit them, so people realize that we don't know if we can believe what that person said about them, because, the person that they've been talking about, they said this about that person, so who knows who we can believe anymore, right? So we can't even trust that. Problem solved. It's so much easier than actually having a personal conversation with someone to try to clear something up, especially when you've been deeply hurt. But yet, the apostles have a different approach. They have kind of a Jesus approach. As we wrap things up, we're done with the kind of the meat, the points of what we're going to talk about. This is how Paul wraps up this section. He says, we have become to others as the scum of the world. The dregs, like the residue on a pot, the most worthless part of something, of all things, even until now. He's saying because we choose humility, people treat us like scum, right? We still use that in our vocabulary today. He says, I don't write these things to shame you. I'm not trying to shame you, because it's an honor-shame culture where shame, hits people deep. He says, that's not my goal. I just want to admonish you like my beloved children. I want to talk to you like a dad to his kids in this moment. He says, if you were to have countless tutors in Christ, you wouldn't have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus, I became your father through the gospel. He says, I just want to be your dad and give you some fatherly wisdom about what it's really like to follow Jesus. Therefore, I urge you to be imitators of me. That person that looks like the fool in the theater and the criminal and the captive that people are pointing at, that person that does stuff that you and your culture find like reprehensible, that person who just seems to take insults without fighting back, seems to try to be gracious and just absorb it and have conversations and communicate when you think it'd be so much more effective to just write someone off or, again, destroy their reputation. Like that person, like, you need to be more like me, actually. For this reason, I've sent Timothy to you, who's my beloved and faithful child in the Lord. And he'll remind you of my ways which are in Christ, just as I teach everywhere in every church. So we get from this statement that Paul didn't just write a letter, he sent it. And along with the letter came Timothy, who he says is my faithful child in the Lord. And that might be a little bit of a admonition to the Corinthians as well, saying like, if you want to see an example of how somebody who is a child trying to imitate the Lord, what their life looks like, here's Timothy, just watch him for a few days, you'll kind of get the hint, right? He'll remind you of some things you've forgotten about. So how do we take this and interact with it personally? How do we humble ourselves in the way that we approach people and imitate Paul, imitate Timothy, imitate Jesus, most importantly? Here's some questions that you might be able to ask yourself, I might be able to ask myself to kind of bring this into our world as we leave here today. 1, what is one unfamiliar, undesirable, or even humiliating role or task that you could take on to better serve your church family or neighbors? Because I think Paul was trying to point the Corinthians to like consider that. What's a role or a task that you could do that's kind of beneath you? And this gets tricky too, because even for us, there are certain things that are culturally out of place. Maybe because of the job you work or the position that you are in society, or even among your neighbors or your family members, you doing certain tasks would just seem out of place. People might kind of think, oh, that's odd that they're doing that. Or even with gender. So I've had conversations recently with people because I recognize there's a big difference between the way that my father and I operate. In my dad's generation, he's in his 70s now, I mean, there were certain things that men did not do. When he attended college, just to give you an example, his younger sister attended the same college, and every week my dad would drop his laundry off with his younger sister, and she would wash and dry and fold his clothes and return them to him. Because in their household growing up, men just did not do the laundry, right? And so there are some things that are associated in different generations with roles of a specific gender. And maybe that's even something in our culture that for you to take on a certain task for somebody else to serve them, it might even seem kind of like embarrassing for you. But I would propose maybe those are the kinds of things that the apostles were focused on doing. The stuff that's less familiar, less comfortable, less desirable, or even kind of embarrassing or humiliating in a sense. That's, I think, maybe headed toward what true humility in a community of people is like. And so maybe there's something that you see, a need that you see, a way to serve someone, but it pushes you out of your comfort zone. I think about a guy down the road from us who is he had gray hair like me, and I thought he was ancient, like in his 70s or 80s. When I look back and do the math, I think he was probably in his 40s at the time. But he would babysit me for my parents on occasion. His daughter would babysit us, and she was a teenager. But sometimes she wasn't available, and so Mr. Sanders would have us over in his living room for, horse rides around the living room on the floor. And he'd play on the floor with toys with us for a couple hours. And that was not something that his generation was comfortable with, but he would do it for us. And so maybe there's something like that you could take on, a more humble role. Maybe there's a way that you could give generously to somebody in your local church community who seems to be lacking some basic needs. Maybe this is going to cost you because you don't have a lot to begin with, or maybe it's something where you've been fairly blessed in a sense to have enough for you and your family. But you look around, and here's some things that I would encourage you to look for or listen for. I would almost guarantee there are people in this room today that can't afford healthy food, okay? And sometimes you can tell it through conversations. Sometimes you can tell it through just people's physical appearance. But maybe there's a need for healthy food. Maybe it's for correctly sized, seasonally appropriate clothes. You look around and you think, man, those kids, or that adult, they wear that almost every single week. And, it looks kind of worn, or, it's winter and they have a t-shirt on, or it's summer and they've got a long sleeve shirt on. Maybe those are signs that people are struggling more than you would imagine. Maybe it's consistent work. Somebody's willing to work hard, but they get laid off a lot, or their trade or the skill that they have, it's inconsistent. Maybe people are working 40 hours a week, and as you learn more about their job and their pay, you realize that's not a livable wage. As I worked 40 hours a week at this hotel, I realized, these people are grossing maybe $30,000 to $35,000 a year, and it costs about twice that much to get by in our culture today. And so there's a lot of jobs where people are working hard, but struggling to make it month to month. Maybe it's for dependable housing. Somebody is looking for a place that they can rent consistently, or somebody's struggling to maintain the housing that they have. Maybe it's people that can't afford medical or dental care, and you just happen to overhear these things. And even if you don't, sometimes we become aware of things, and we can be the go-between to get resources to somebody who's in need here in our congregation. But how could you give generously to somebody in your own church community? If this isn't your home church, maybe apply it where you live or where you're from. And then finally, what's one way that you could respond graciously or supportively or personally to someone who has hurt you, which is the hardest by far? And I can give you many personal examples of how that's difficult, How could you be gracious or respond personally to somebody who's hurt you, or maybe somebody who's been hurt by others? Maybe it's looking around us like the apostles saw each other being mistreated in different ways, and it's stepping in to be more supportive in someone else's life. I'm not telling you to go home and do all those things as your homework for the week, but I would challenge you to at least consider and pray about one of those three opportunities, because I think it's pointless if we hear about these things on Sunday and do nothing to transform our own lives, because doing these kinds of things is actually living out Jesus' teaching. It's actually following Jesus in a very real, tangible way. And so let's take a page out of Paul's playbook for the Corinthians and try to go low some of those ways this week and learn more about what humility physically looks like.